Hello, class, and welcome to module number 3 in Business 181, Global Business. We will now begin our review of what we've discussed so far, and I hope you found it interesting and beneficial. Now, this is about a 50-minute long presentation, so get settled, and maybe you might want to be prepared to take some notes. You can always go back to these illustrations, though. So first of all, let's begin with a review. And we're going to go quickly to our learning objectives. Well, we want to increase our awareness of just how big the global business world is. And I think you've been doing a good job of increasing your awareness in that area. We also want to understand the importance of it, and be familiar with the many drivers and influences. And then as we move through the course, we'll be talking about effective intercultural communication. Okay, one of the things we want to look at very quickly is multinational corporations. As you can see, there are many of them that have invested internationally. By definition, a multinational corporation is one that resides in at least 2 countries. So here's some more, and God, so many of these are recognizable. You can see they have taken the opportunity to do their manufacturing, distribution, and marketing in those countries. Some of the largest global 500 companies, and all of these are international, believe it or not, is Walmart, 22 million, the biggest in terms of employees. Most of these other companies are oil producers. And then we have Volkswagen and Toyota. Too bad Honda's not there. Okay, so what is foreign direct investment? It is a direct investment into production or business in a country by a company in another country, either by one of 2 things. A, buying a company in the target country, or B, expanding operations of an existing business in that country. There are scenarios to think about. One is risks. When you're depending upon suppliers and logistics nodes that are connected, some of the things that can be either work in your favor or be problematic are time to receive your orders, economic downturns in the country of your trading partner, product risks in terms of demand fluctuations you didn't forecast properly, or for whatever the reason, similar to the chip situation in Thailand for electronic production, they can't keep up with the targets of performance. And then country risk. You never know if there's going to be some sort of coup d'etat, government takeover, or whatever. If they're developed countries, it's less likely. But if you're flirting with the idea of countries that are less developed, that's always a possibility. These are the realities of the risk. I mentioned, I think 2 times so far, that the 4 risks of international business, and these are extremely important. Each one of these components are things that could contribute to a commercial risk, or the 4 components here of currency, cross-cultural risks, and country risks. Now, I would, again, keep these very, very handy because you're going to be asked to write a paper. And certainly there are some things there that might behoove you to explore further as you put your ideas together for a paper. Also, I mean, here's a good example of something that could happen in the country is Brexit, where the Brits decided to leave the European Union. And I don't know what they were thinking about in terms of scenarios or potential problems, but you can look at the numbers on the right. Export, 41% down. Imports, 29%. Salmon exportation from their fishing, 98%. Beef production, 98%. An overall loss of trade somewhere between 20 and 50%. Not only that, even if you were doing business and things seem to be a little bit more healthy, the amount of red tape and paper that need to be filled out in order to execute things now is a problem, which delays processing time. The YouTube that I have put here, the URL, is something that I would ask you to take a look into, and you're going to see more of these on each of these slides, so you can enrich my message more. Again, fishing, big problem in some of the countries that were used to buying fish or fishing in British waters where it was legal. They are without fish. And it's funny that the British aren't big fish eaters or beef eaters, but again, they've deprived other countries of fishing. Then you have natural disasters, COVID, earthquakes, floods. You have a blockage of the Suez Canal. I mentioned Brexit, and then you have electronic chips. So depending on how forward thinking or psychic you can be, you may want to carry enough inventory to withstand any kind of a problem such as the ones that are outlined here. But the problem is inventory costs money, and it sits and it sits, and you wait for its return on the investment. So it's always a trade-off between which way you want to go. You take other disasters. This is a picture of Lebanon right now. The country's in shambles. They had some silos that contained ammonium nitrate. Well, it's highly explosive. It blew up, wrecked a big portion of the city, and now their business, where they used to export fruit, tobacco, construction material, paper, and even some textile materials, that's gone, and the whole country is in poverty right now. As we look at container ships, the ship, the Evergreen, which is the biggest container ship ever made, got stuck sideways in the Suez Canal. So that means that everything that was in these containers never made their way to market. In fact, 12% of the world trade flows through the Suez Canal. It's been said that there was a loss in trade of $400 million per hour, or $10 billion per day. Now, this is going to have to be dealt with through the insurance companies. So you can bet probably with expense incurred on all parties, you'll see an increase in the cost of goods in the future. And then, of course, we have things like this that happen periodically. In the automobile business, in the United States in particular, and even Europe, they've always tried to have lean production. That means almost just in time. If you actually in a Toyota plant, next to a vehicle that's being assembled, you have parts in bins that are representative of the next 5 hours worth of assembly. About 4 hours into it, more parts are delivered. These parts aren't held in warehouses or produced by suppliers. When you look at just-in-time manufacturing or lean distribution, normally businesses would carry safety stock. So in other words, if you probably have about a third of your normal inventory requirement set aside in case there was a problem. Well, now inventories have been reduced, safety stocks have been diminished, and there's very little tolerance at all if there's any kind of a problem with the supply chain. Retail customers will suffer. And as we look at the automobile business, all right, the auto industry may lose. This was a little while ago, this illustration was published, $61 billion of 2021 chip sales. And because of this, General Motors plants, they're down 66% in the time they operate. Ford had to cancel production of their Ford F-150 truck in one of their plants. And Toyota has set their sights at an annual production of 80,000 units less than what they had anticipated. So now, as this slide's a little bit different than the earlier one, but now already year to date, $110 billion loss to the automotive industry as a result of not having chips. Now just imagine building an airplane such as the 737, where parts of a different nature come from all over the world. You can imagine how disrupted the supply chain would be. So also, we talked about, and you saw them in the different articles that you read, that there's always the assertion that outsourcing or dealing with manufacturers from other countries will reduce the productivity and livelihood of many workers. Well, in many cases, this is true. When the Japanese first came into the automobile business, many factories in the Midwest had to close. In fact, I remember visiting dealers in the Midwest and seeing all sorts of, like, for example, Delco Electronics suppliers with their plants closed, with cyclone fences around them and weeds coming out of the cracks in the cement. So it can diminish jobs, but on the other hand, you have to remember it can create some jobs in order to support outsourcing. We talked a little bit about protectionism and free trade. And again, protectionism is against everything that Adam Smith advocated. So when you look at all these things, if you're in business, number one, could there be a job loss from outsourcing? Will it increase GDP per capita? In other words, enrich in the lives of people in terms of spending? Will more jobs be created to support international trade? Will it create a trade deficit? Or will it experience great growth and prosperity from countries such as those mentioned in your case study of foreign direct investment in the automobile industry, where it was very beneficial? So in terms of a reality check, what is the best balance? These are all the things that need to be examined. In any event, whatever happens will affect shareholders, people who own stock, stakeholders, people who deal with or work for the companies, and the populations at large. So that's a quick review and a little bit of a preview about what we're going to speak about in module number 3. So please stay with me as we move along with our next lecture. So we're going to start off with a couple of influences on international trade. 3 things: absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and opportunity costs. Now here are some definitions. Absolute advantage refers to a country's ability to produce a certain good more efficiently than another country. And we'll talk about these. Specialization refers to a country's decision to specialize in the production of a certain good or list of goods because of the advantages it possesses in their production. Opportunity cost refers to what you sacrifice in making an economic choice. In this instance, it refers to the value of the goods you sacrifice in deciding to produce one good instead of another. I'll talk more about all of these. And comparative advantage refers to a country's ability to produce a particular good with a lower opportunity cost than another country. Well, so much for those definitions. I'll give you a little more insight. So let's talk about Switzerland. Here was a country that basically had an absolute advantage in the area of fine watch manufacturing. It was perfect where they were located. Their technological edge went back 100 years. Nobody could compete with them. The country had great wealth. and highly educated people. Well, it looked just great for them, and it had been for a long time. If you take a look at absolute advantage and comparative advantage, here's Henry Ford's plant on the Rouge River in Detroit, Michigan. They had the right inflow of products because the river was there, and coal and steel and goods to be manufactured in wood was delivered on those barges. They had the technology, the wealth, and the workers were highly educated in automobile manufacturing. So companies that have a comparative advantage over others in producing a particular good, if they can produce that good at a lower relative opportunity cost. In other words, to make sure that they're making best use of all the assets they have at their disposal. So you take a absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Japan was one of the first to introduce robots in mass production automobile manufacturing. Well, robots are used in just about everything nowadays. That gives that particular company a tremendous comparative advantage over other companies that don't have that resource. Companies have a comparative advantage over others in producing a particular good if they can produce that good at a lower cost. And this is where robotics came in, especially in Japan. Opportunity costs. Now, at Honda, we had customers that complained, unfortunately, and they were handled on a case-by-case basis by analysts. But because we had a number of recalls, there were a lot of people that required special handling or reimbursement for work that was done. That didn't require a lot of skill, and we didn't want that operation to take away from all of our other operations in terms of human resources and budget. So what did we do? We outsourced it to other companies. Telespectrum was one of them. We didn't want to use our resources on something else that we could farm out to somebody. So definition, the potential benefits an individual investor or business misses out when choosing one alternative over another. You know, if I have a high volume pizza parlor, is it good for me to make all the dough and make all the different crusts on each individual pizza? Yeah, it'll give you a wonderful pizza. Or could I just buy it from somebody else who does that? Well, if you were the store owner, you would have to decide which one to do. But if you were using this prefab crust, your production would be up and probably your cost would be down. Just another decision. Specialization. I already mentioned the Swiss watch industry. But you take a company like Rolex, it was very, very comfortable, or IWC, or Breitling, all these other companies. Suddenly, the Japanese came out with electronic cheap watches. And believe it or not, it took a huge chunk out of the market that people like Rolex had because they were specialized. That's all they knew how to do. So for a while there, the Swiss made their money selling cuckoo clocks and chocolates while the Japanese began to dominate the market. Tough story, but again, almost every day in business, you need to look at scenarios and potential problems. Sleep with one eye open, if you will. Specialization is an interesting thing. Dole pineapple in Hawaii, well, they had everything. They had the climate, they had the soil, cheap labor, so on and so forth. But over a period of time, it was deemed that the value of the dirt, the ground, the land, was more important than pineapple production. So they were specialized on that, and they had to stop because the whole island was bought by a business magnate, it's a kind of a Steve Jobs type called Larry Ellison, who was the CEO of Oracle. He bought 85% of the island from the Hawaiian government for $300 million. And on that island, he built 2 luxury hotels, Four Seasons hotels. And I stayed in those hotels on dealer's trips. And when you go there on a little puddle jumper plane, you essentially are faced with nothing but the ruins of pineapples, ground dug up everywhere. And then the resort, I'm not too sure it's in this picture, but it might be over here. One's on this side of the island, one's on the other. But all of this land now is obsolete. Talk about specialization. Look at Vermont. They make maple syrup, and they have what it takes in terms of the resources that are required to give them that absolute advantage. Nobody else is growing this maple syrup. Their climate's perfect. And they specialize in that. So you don't want to get in a war with companies that have these kind of resources. Deciding what market to get in is very important. And you really want to make sure that you don't go up against a giant in international trade. So usually specialization by definition refers to within the borders. Michelin, they grow tires made out of rubber, but they invested in plants in Vietnam and other places where the climate was more suitable. They weren't going to try to make rubber over here, even in the hot climates, but they had ample cheap labor in different parts of the world. Vietnam was one, for example. Also, the Congo in Africa was another. But again, the ability to grow rubber, and that being a company of theirs there, gave them an absolute advantage. Same with Starbucks. I mean, you take a place like Ohio, they make wheat, but the soil conditions and the temperature and the labor required wouldn't be good for coffee beans. So Starbucks, has an absolute advantage by having these companies in other parts of the world. For example, Africa, they grow all sorts of coffee beans for their use. Again, you can see some YouTube clips I put there for you. So opportunity cost, this is a great definition, is the cost of taking one decision over another, like my pizza crust. This cost is not only financial, but also in time, effort, and utility. Opportunity cost can lead to optimal decision making when factors such as price, time, effort, and utility are considered. So it's one good way to avoid a bad investment or a bad decision. And it's a good way to recognize this factor and make the right choices. So now let's look a little bit about world trade by country. First of all, I want to talk about North America and Western Europe. So over here on the left, we have the European Union, where these countries have all created trade blocs that work favorably with one another, namely very minimal tariffs or none. Over here, we have the same thing between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and this was called the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it had to do with the U.S. and Canada. So in these countries, they've experienced great wealth as a result of lessening barriers. Now, the European Union originally consisted of 28 countries. Now it's 27 because Great Britain, United Kingdom over here, decided they would be better off alone. You can take a look at some clips, 2 of them, that have to do with the European Union. NAFTA in the United States and North America boosted trade by eliminating all tariffs between the 3 countries. It also created agreements on international rights. And this is one of the good things that Bill Clinton did. Between 1993 and 2019, trade between the three members quadrupled from 290 billion to 1.23 trillion. So now we'll move on to trade barriers. So protectionism is an example, something Adam Smith abhorred, placing limits on foreign trade to product industries and businesses at home. But we'll look at economic systems first. And in your book, they depict four different types of, if I'll get this right, economies. Market economies, which is pure, free enterprise capitalism. There's a command economy, an economic system in which the government owns the operations and the factors of production. This is socialism and communism. If you've been studying up on Cuba, when Batista was the president of Cuba, it was strictly capitalism with all of the casinos and U.S. investments down there. When Castro came along and created a civil war, all those companies became socialized and communistic owned. So we're talking about Cuba and China. Then we have mixed economies, an economic system that has features of both market and command economies, such as the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. And then traditional economies, and this has to do with basically agricultural and hunting, almost like hunting-gatherers that you can find. There's no industrialization, rather agrarian, and these would be the Aboriginal people in Australia. The World Trade Organization produces a summary every year of world travel profiles or tariff profiles. If you really want to read something that could really put you to sleep, you can get your hands on these or find them on the internet. So trade barriers, tariffs, what do they do? Well, first they increase country revenue. It's a great source of revenue to a country. They can restrict the import of competitive goods. For example, I mean, if you were in France, do you want California wine coming in? Or you produce steel in the United States? Do you want Chinese steel coming in? And it can also be potentially punitive in being a measure that punishes a country for not being a friend of the United States. And that's a good example here, trade barriers with China. Trump upped the tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, and since then, that has generated $69 billion worth of goods. And if you look at tariffs, you can see so many different countries. Some are very low. Canada, 1.5% because it's a NAFTA country. European Union countries, great. You get up here, Brazil, 8.6. Well, again, they're in turmoil, not only politically, but economically, presently. And also they're harnessed with tremendous COVID growth there. And a president that's going, Bolsonaro, that'll probably be on the out soon. But the United States is at 7.5%. This is not the original idea. But the 7.5% includes the 25% tariff on $326 billion of Chinese goods. So you can see the impact of tariffs. It can be good or bad, used in a number of different ways. So the next thing is global performance. How do you measure it? Well, gross domestic product is basically a measure, and it's usually percentage based for the previous year. But it's the total value of output of goods and service produced in an economy in a given period of time. And there's a lot of fine print here about gross national product. I have a video for you, but the idea is this: if we have Ford in the United States producing product, but they also have plants in other countries, and they're paying wages and getting revenue, etc., tariffs, all of that will go into the calculation total called gross national product. Not just what you have in the United States, but sources of money exchange in other countries are all calculated into GNP. So usually in a country that had direct foreign investment or foreign direct investment, you would see they also had not only a good GDP, but a good GNP. World indicators in business right now with $23 trillion, $18 trillion in goods and service, in goods, and it should be 5 trillion in services. So with all this trade, is there a possibility that you'll be buying more than you're selling as a country? Well, that's called a trade deficit. And it's been said that it can be harmful to developing countries because they have such a dependency on other countries. And there's also a chance that authorities can do some skimming or engage in some unethical behavior. It encourages outsourcing because they're not developing their own markets. It can lead to foreign ownership, total, and potential reduction in currency values. And again, you can have a trade imbalance between imports and exports. Here's a little video for you. By definition, the balance of trade is calculated by subtracting the value of exports from imports, and that gives you your balance of trade. A trade deficit occurs when the value of a country's exports exceed the value of its imports exceed the value of its exports, with imports and exports referring both to goods or products and services. It's not healthy to have too great of a trade imbalance because there's tremendous dependency on other countries. One other factor that goes into international trade is exchange rates. What is your dollar worth compared to other countries? I mean, it's great if it's worth more, but if it's worth less, it's a problem. My wife and I do a lot of international travel, or we did before COVID, and I did for Honda. And the truth is that, I would go to, a Western European country, and my dollar was worth 25% less when I went to a foreign country. So again, that goes into your calculations. And by the way, there's a thing called arbitrage that many corporations engage in, which is the buying and selling of currency to your advantage. So is trade imbalance a bad thing? Well, if it's too much, it could be. Again, let's just go back, and I'm not going to read all of this. This is for your reference, but a strong dollar versus a weak dollar. You hear this. If you're not familiar with it, read up on this page. And again, I already mentioned the risk associated with them. For example, if I was buying, let's see, France, something in this color, part of that fuselage or the rudder, I would have to work out a payment agreement that took into consideration the euro versus the dollar over a period of time. How long are we going to maintain that price? So if you look at this world economy, the big players are the United States and China presently, also the European Union. Japan's not doing too badly, but then you have a lot of other countries that are really way down there. Africa in particular is a very, very poor country. You can look over here, some of the divisions. And Mexico, even though it's small, makes a major contribution to the United States, China, and Canada. Okay, another thing that's important to consider, GDP is one measurement, but GDP uh, by population or per capita is an indicator of the wealth of a country. So, for example, you take a place like China, the GDP is just fantastic, but GDP per person is nothing. So, therefore, it is a very poor country for most people. So, per capita, again, the Swiss over here, very wealthy countries, United States, and then you move down through other countries. But these are all pretty much well developed countries and very affluent. It's the top countries. And countries can be broken down into three categories, with GDP and gross national income, which is top tier, second tier, base of the pyramid. These are the poorest people in the world. And again, you can see some categories here. These numbers over here differ a little bit. You'll find that in your research depending upon when the report was made. Even right now with COVID, the numbers are different. But again, you see the high income countries, the middle income countries, and then you go down in the poor. Of course, the United States is in here. When we talk about emerging markets, they refer to some of them as BRIC, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, because the places are gigantic and they have the opportunity to do a lot of trade. And we call many of these emerging markets, the emerging market economy is the economy of a developing nation that is becoming more engaged with the global market as it grows. Here's a breakdown. If you look at these, you can see they're broken into three categories here: the Americas, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Asia. So that means these are countries that you may want to do business with them because they are now starting to do business in the world and they're growing. As a matter of fact, looking at their numbers, 48% of world trade comes from them, 60% of foreign direct investment inflow into their country is in those countries, and then 40% of foreign direct investment is outflow, what's being exported. Then we have emerging markets, and you saw some of the categories: lower than average per capita income, brisk economic growth, high volatility, some currency swings, and growth potential. And again, these are some of these countries that contribute to this. And there they are again. And then you have underdeveloped countries. Here's the definition. I'll read it. An underdeveloped country is one in which per capita real income is low when compared with per capita real income of the United States of America, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. Now, in this sense, an adequate synonym would be poor countries. This definition brings out an important feature of underdeveloped countries, namely poverty. I mean, you can see this, Haiti, poor Haiti, they've had earthquakes, tidal waves, etc. And this is what it looks like in many parts. And even in fact, in Mexico, you'll see some of this. On the other hand, you have other countries that are flourishing, and they're great investments, and they're growing all the time, and they control the economic power of the world. The top trading powers of the United States partners are Canada and Mexico, and of course, one-sided, but China. But these two are part of the European Union, and that's why it shows here. And then you have the remainder of the countries. You can see Brazil down here. And here's a look at our trading partners in terms of numbers. And here's our trading partners in terms of inflow and outflow. So China basically is great for inflow, as you can see and as we all know. One of the other things that needs to be taken into consideration is corruption when you're dealing with countries. There's a report that comes out every year. This is a non-government organization, also known as NGO. They put out a corruption perception index. That means it's not based on hard facts, but perceptions of other people that deal with them. And you have some of the worst with the best. But let me first talk about the profile of corruption. Excess government regulation. That means there's a bureaucracy where there's a lot of hands on the way to getting what you want. These are usually insular and more close to international trade. They have low education levels. They don't have much political freedom or media freedom. There's no checks and balances. The government does what they want, therefore they're poorly governed, and they're very famous for skimming money off the top. The least corrupt countries you can see on this chart. And then over here, again, the least corrupt. But you get into countries, most of them in places, most of them are in Africa at this point, a huge continent, many businesses, natural resources there, very rich country. But the bureaucracy there is famous for corruption. If you're choosing a partner, here are some of the factors, and I have here choosing a plant, company A, and I'm assuming this would be in one country and company B would be in another. So you'd be looking at things like labor costs, distance to world markets, what's your logistics cost going to be? Your workforce availability, whether you're an emerging country or not, how well educated the population is, your social structure, whether there's, take for example, a place where there's an oligarchy with a tremendously small number of very wealthy, and then there's a large gap between the rich and the poor. How many languages are spoken, labor relations, political stability, religious influence. Now I want to offer that this particular page, and then the other illustration I pointed out to you was the risk page. These two are extremely important if you were going to be making any decision on any international trading partner, no matter what part of the world they're in. So please keep that in mind on those two illustrations. You have a lot of food for thought, you might call it. And that's it for module number 4. I know this was a little bit long, but I'm telling you, it's power packed. And if you take this and also in conjunction with your textbook readings, your reflection papers, your discussions, and your quizzes, you've got a whole lot to think about. And I hope you're having fun, because for me, I think this is eye-opening to many students. And I think it'll pave the way for you to have greater wisdom about where things come from and how they get there and how much they cost in the future. Also, I wanted to mention, don't forget you have a midterm exam, which is essay. And again, let's stay on our schedule. Remember the 5 Ps. And I want to thank you for being in my class. I got to tell you, the assignments that I've been receiving right now are very well written and very, very thought content. So thank you very much, and I'll be posting this very shortly, and you will have module number 4 coming.